Welcome to today's webinar, How-Tos of Publishing. My name is Romy, and I'm the ICEDA coordinator, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered virtually on the traditional and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples across Canada. We recognize and respect their enduring connection to the land and their contribution to knowledge and learning. And today we are thrilled to have Hilary Belville with us. Hilary works with Canadian Science Publishing and brings extensive experience in guiding researchers through the publishing process. She will share practical tips and strategies to help you publish successfully. And before we start, here are some information. This session is currently recorded. The recording will be shared with you afterward. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. Feel free to post your question in the chat at any time. I've been monitoring it throughout the session. And we'll have about 10 more minutes for Q&A at the end. So please stay with us for that. And I think now it's my pleasure to hand things over to Hilary Belville. Hilary, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to share my slides. There we are. All right, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for this workshop, the How-Tos of Publishing, also navigating the path to publication. I'm Hilary. I'm the Journal Development Specialist for FACETS, published by Canadian Science Publishing. I'm delighted to be here with you today to discuss publishing. First off, I'd like to acknowledge where I'm presenting from. I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, which is the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Canadian Science Publishing recognizes and respects the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands known as Canada and worldwide, on whose territories we and our research contributors are privileged to live, work, and learn. We gratefully acknowledge the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, on whose unceded and unsurrendered territory our Ottawa head office is located. We commit to dismantling structures in science publishing that have harmed Indigenous peoples, lands, and knowledges, and to honoring the expertise of Indigenous knowledge keepers, past, present, and emerging, in pursuit of a just and sustainable future for all. So a quick little reminder about the journal. FACETS is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary open access peer-reviewed journal committed to advancing knowledge and published by not-for-profit Canadian Science Publishing. The journal publishes research spanning the biological and physical sciences, including interdisciplinary work that integrates the social sciences. FACETS and ICEDA partnered together back in the spring of 2024. ICEDA and FACETS recognize the value that both organizations can provide to researchers and other professionals engaged in endocrine disruptor research, and we believe this partnership will greatly serve current and future members of the Society. Okay, so for many researchers, the process of writing and submitting your paper to an academic journal is a bit of a black box. You kind of just click and submit and hope for the best. So today I want to try to demystify the process for you a bit, and also talk a little bit about how publishing is changing to address some of the unforeseen barriers that have arisen over the years. I'm going to talk about the advantage of open science, how you can increase the impact of your research, and how to peer review ethically. So you're ready to share your research with the world. And now what? Globally, we're seeing that funders and institutions are moving away from this old idea of publish or perish, as they've realized the huge downsides to this approach. In the reformation of research assessment, there's currently a shift in priority from output to impact. So as researchers, you want to think about how to maximize the impact of your research. For years, institutions looked to the number of scholarly publications, their views and citations as the best measure of research excellence. As you know, an unintended consequence of this value system was the rise of predatory publishing. It's countless for-profit publishers launching journals with low quality and even fraudulent content. While these journals have bill themselves as open access. This is just to be able to collect author processing fees, and they would publish content from anybody willing to pay. This allowed some researchers desperate to increase their number of publications to do so at any cost. Measures such as the journal's impact factor, a metric originally created solely to help librarians decide which journals were worth subscribing to, became a misinformed proxy for quality. Some publishers were accused of artificially inflating their impact, accepting only papers that would be highly cited, with the result being sometimes scientists cutting corners or pursue trends rather than conduct research on important questions. So as you can imagine, this bubble finally burst with numerous cases of fraud, dodgy science, image manipulation, and overstated conclusions making headlines. So now institutions, publishers, and researchers themselves are moving from a system that measures research excellence by output to one that recognizes impact. So this sounds great in theory, but how does a researcher maximize the impact of their work in reality? So when we talk about impact, we're thinking about how to maximize the reach and effect of the research. So to be able to achieve this, research needs to be accessible. So research findings that are kept private, available only to other select researchers, where those who cannot pay or have subscriptions cannot read the findings, that would have very limited impact. What about non-researchers? What about researchers from institutions or places that don't have access to the journals in question? And what about the communities that are most impacted by the results of the studies? Okay, so it needs to be accessible. Research needs to be transparent. Even when research findings are accessible, they're not always transparent. So what were the methods used to carry out the study? Is the research replicable? Is all the data and code needed to validate or replicate the study available? Have the researchers disclosed everything? And how can we better ensure that research is transparent? Research needs to be discoverable. What good is accessible and transparent research if those who need it can't find it? We have to ensure that people can discover the findings that they're trying to disseminate. Research needs to be understandable. If research is written in overly technical language or presented in ways that only experts can interpret, its potential impact is limited. So understandable research broadens who can use the knowledge, supports informed decision making, and it helps ensure that important results are applied in meaningful ways. And else finally, research needs to be diverse. The groups of people conducting research, reviewing research, publishing it, reading it, and benefiting from the research has historically been very homogenized. This has not led towards maximum impact. And funders, institutions, publishers, and policymakers have been rethinking this and the need for more diverse pool of players in research and knowledge exchange. So how can you highlight your research? There are lots of options. Societies that you may be a part of will often have a newsletter. This is from an SCAS newsletter, which is an aquatic science society, and it features a FACETS paper, author Jesse Reynolds, and their recent paper. There are various news outlets. This conversation picked up an article from FACETS on microplastics making their way into farmlands. And there's also lots of scientific blogs that you can collaborate with. This example is from EOS and features a Facets article on recent changes in the diet and survival of Atlantic puffin chicks in Maine. So in trying to figure out some ways to make research more impactful, open science is a great place to start. The most well-known and widespread open science initiative is open access publishing. In the 90s, with the advent of the internet, the open access model of publishing was developed, which made papers available to those outside of universities, such as charities, hospitals, government, and members of the public. Anyone with internet access can access these papers. And that's because open access publishing means that the content is free to read. So for CSP, we see open access as a way to enhance the reach, rigor, and relevance of science, though, so that people can find it, trust it, and use it. Traditionally, for a paper to be published open access, an article processing charge or an APC is paid for by the author. But in the spirit of making things more equitable for authors, many publishers, including CSP, have been moving towards payment models funded by the institutions. And while open access is undoubtedly an important way of making research, which is often funded by taxpayer money, accessible to everybody, people started thinking about how to expand this concept even further. So how can I make my science open? The term open science was coined in 2011, and UNESCO's recommendation on open science is a great place to get a sense of what open science is all about. From the recommendation, there are many helpful descriptors, starting with a definition. Open science is a set of principles and practices to make scientific research from all fields accessible to everyone for the benefit of scientists and society as a whole. So it's a movement not only to ensure that multilingual scientific knowledge is accessible, but also that the production of that knowledge itself is inclusive and equitable. And finally, so that open science opens up the scientific process to those beyond traditional scientific communities. So when we think about the publishing of scientific research, specifically, examples of open science can include open data and open code, preprints, published or open peer review, article types like lab protocols or registered reports, and plain language summaries. Preprints are unique as they've been around since the 90s, well before the term open science existed, and there are currently a wide variety of subject-specific preprint servers. So for example, for earth science, there's Earth Archive, and for life sciences, there's bioRxiv. CSP encourages preprint submissions to all our journals, but it's up to the authors. Thinking more about open science, a number of publishers as well as funding agencies around the world have been moving towards requiring open data. So some scientific societies and publishers are requiring open data as well. So open data generally means that the data and code underlying the findings of a study are openly accessible, reusable, and shareable. Data sharing is good for research and researchers alike. Among its many benefits, data sharing can enhance the reproducibility of research. It can promote discoverability and collaboration, and it can increase the trust, transparency, and reuse of research data. That said, not all data should be open. For example, sensitive data that could be used to identify vulnerable populations. Most institutional and funder policies mandate that data should be as open as possible, as closed as necessary. This means that open data is the default unless there are ethical, legal, or commercial restrictions. Before any research project begins, it's essential that everyone involved in the research project has conversations about the data ownership and management. Additionally, at CSP, we support the FAIR principles for all papers that report data. These guidelines, which were published in 2016, aim to improve findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets. We also support the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, which are often relevant to research published in our journals. These were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance to complement the FAIR principles. So the CARE principles emphasize the importance of collective benefit of the data for Indigenous peoples, the importance of authority to control, recognizing and empowering the rights of and interests of Indigenous peoples, responsibility, so to support Indigenous people's self-determination and nurture relationships and build capacity, and the importance of ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. Knowledge translation and mobilization are other components of open science. We encourage authors to submit graphical abstracts with their papers to increase accessibility, reader interest, and discoverability. Infographics and visual abstracts highlight the key findings and can quickly communicate what your research is about. These tools are especially useful for busy stakeholders who don't have time to read a full article. Here's a couple of examples of some infographics that we've published. Some journals also publish plain language summaries with their manuscripts. A plain language summary should be concise, clear, and free of jargon. It should aim to highlight why the work was done, how it was done, and what was discovered. Minimum of 250 words, but a maximum of 500 words. And it should include a plain language title that is different from your manuscript or your article. Okay, so here's a fun fact. Research papers with plain language summaries and clinical trial protocols with extenders attracted 144% higher views than those without these supplemental resources. So extenders is a term used in medical publishing for digital tools that present the research in an alternative format. So this include infographics, graphical abstracts, video abstracts, supplementary podcasts, and translations. As we touched upon earlier, research and publishing has historically been quite homogenous. In response, researchers have pushed their institutions, funding agencies, and publishers to start thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusivity. One way we've done this at CSP is to provide guidelines on community engaged research. We found that although many Indigenous groups, universities, and funding agencies have developed guidelines for conducting this kind of research, at a time there was very little literature on how to report the research. So as a publisher, we want to provide authors with all the tools and information they need so that they can be inclusive throughout the research process and report these actions in their papers. So regardless of the extent of engagement, we want to normalize authors disclosing the work that goes into supporting the collaboration. So this info here that you see can be found on our Info to Authors webpage if you're interested. So moving from output to impact and from quality over quantity of publications, peer review remains a central player to publishing. So when we say quality peer review, we mean that it should be rigorous, robust, and unbiased. We should start thinking about the goal of scientific writing, which is to communicate the findings of your research clearly so your readers can understand what you did, why you did it, what you found, and what significance it might have for your research field. So let's walk through a typical research paper. All papers will differ somewhat in structure, but in general, you can ask yourself these core questions while peer reviewing to determine if they meet the criteria for publishing. So you can also apply these questions to your own papers as you prepare to submit it to a journal. So what makes a high quality paper? Here's some tips on what to look for while reviewing. To start, no matter what type of study you are conducting, there should always be a clear research question. Papers are sometimes rejected because they present what some people call a fishing experiment, which is when you go out sampling or conducting experiments just to see whatever you find and report on it. Instead, authors should develop a research question that they will aim to answer through the course of the study. This is all laid out in the introduction, where the stage is set for why they come up with this research question. They'll discuss the background of the field, what is known, and what gaps exist in the current body of knowledge. This is where they'll demonstrate the new insight that their question will add to the field of research and how it will expand that body of knowledge. Explaining this well is the key to avoiding rejection for lack of novelty. You don't want your work to be merely derivative of previous work, but instead be a clear, logical next step for the literature. If a study hasn't met this basic criteria, it hasn't made a compelling argument for publication. The results of your efforts to answer your research question should be reproducible, and this is accomplished through clear reporting of your methods. This section should provide enough details so that another researcher could easily reproduce the results of the study. The method should be appropriate to truly test the hypothesis in a logical way. The methods is also where the author should describe ethical considerations for experiments that involve animals or human participants, including community engagement. So throughout this section, you want the authors to be clear enough so that the reviewers and readers don't have any lingering questions or doubt about the work. So it's concise. The methods section should also describe statistical analyses that were used, including which programs or packages used and their versions, as well as where the readers can find the raw data and relevant code. This sets you up nicely for clear reporting of the results to follow, stating clearly what the authors found with the relevant values and statistics, supporting them with tables and figures when appropriate. The interpretation of the results should be saved for the discussion and conclusion. Okay, so in a system where the most groundbreaking and click-worthy papers are often given priority, it's tempting to overstate your conclusions. However, this makes for poor science. Your conclusions should only claim as much as shown by your results. Your discussion section is where you should be linking your results and your assessment of those results to the existing literature to build and present a body of evidence to the reader, keeping in mind the research question you explicitly set out to study. You should present your conclusions conservatively, such as because of A, B, and C, we posit a theory whereby, and leave any speculation for future research questions. Ensuring there's a solid line of logic and reason from your background and literature review leading into your research question through your methods to your results and continuing to follow that logic when you reach your discussion to build your conclusion can help ensure you've written a clear, reproducible piece of work that will be a valuable addition to the published literature. One of the things to think about in terms of peer review is the system itself. We've been talking a lot about paradigm shifts in research assessment and publishing, and downsides to the peer review system have also become evident over the years. If we look at the history of peer review, it's a relatively new system, even though scientific research and publishing is quite old. Scientific journals have existed since the 17th century, but the system of peer review as we know it has only been around since about the 50s. The most common model of peer review today is what we call single anonymous. CSP journals, for the most part, use single anonymous peer review. So it's important that both the manuscripts under review and peer reviewer names remain confidential. Manuscripts are considered confidential while in peer review. Reviewers should hold in confidence manuscripts they are sent, destroying any copies should they decline to review or once their reviews are complete. Don't share the article with anyone else. Reviewers should not use information gained in peer review to their own advantage, such as using the findings from unpublished articles in their own research. To waive anonymity, reviewers may sign their comments to the authors, in which case both the authors and co-reviewers will see their name. To remain anonymous, reviewers should ensure that their comments and any review files they upload, including annotated manuscripts, PDFs, do not inadvertently disclose their name or initials. Reviewers should never communicate directly with an author unless agreed upon by the editor. Instead, you can communicate directly with the editor and the editorial office. Reviewers may disclose having reviewed for a journal, but they may not specify the manuscript or the contents of the review, either before or after the review is complete. If the editor has agreed, reviewers may co-review with a colleague or a trainee. However, the primary reviewer is expected to ensure that others understand the confidentiality of peer review, independently assess the manuscript, approve the final comments, and disclose the co-reviewer's participation in the confidential comments to the editor. Note that our peer review platform can only credit the report to one reviewer, and that's the person who is assigned as peer reviewer in Scholar One. However, many folks have noted challenges to the single anonymous model. In this model, it's been found that knowing the author's names, country of origin, and institution can foster bias in the system. Interestingly, in the systems where both parties are anonymized, those from prestigious institutions and with strong reputations found that their research is reviewed a bit more rigorously. This has led to some journals introducing double anonymous review, where the authors and reviewers are unknown to one another, but editors and staff know the identities of the both parties for admin reasons. Some publishers have taken on opposite approach and have made both party identities known. Usually this doesn't happen until after publication. So in the transparent or published review model, both parties agree that if the paper is accepted, the full back and forth between the reviewers and authors will be published. In this model, sometimes the reviewers remain anonymous though. Okay, going back to the issue of bias affecting peer review, there are many types of unconscious bias, and they can show up in a lot of different ways when handling articles and peer review. Gender or name bias might prejudice you against an author group or keep you from inviting someone as a reviewer. Affinity bias is a tendency to prefer and trust people similar to ourselves. So you might be more positively disposed to research from your own country or invite and lend more weight to reviewers from your former school or institution. If you're assigned a manuscript whose authors used a research method you don't favor, confirmation bias might have you inviting reviewers who share your views. There are countless ways that unconscious bias can influence your everyday decision making, including potentially your initial assessment of an article, selecting who should review the article, how you interpret and value reports from different reviewers, and what revision comments you prioritize. So, to take steps to mitigate bias in your thought process, first recognize that having biases is an inevitable feature as being human. We all have them. Second, think about what some of your biases may be, or even take some of the implicit association tests for insights. And importantly, when it comes to editorial work, first off, you want to slow down. A heavy cognitive load triggers mental shortcuts. So it's worth carving out space for editor tasks. Quick decisions made on the run are more prone to bias. You want to adopt objective measures. So become familiar with those key questions to ask when assessing a new manuscript. And finally, practice personal reflection. Occasionally ask yourself, why do I think that? Or what am I missing? It can help sharpen your judgment. You'll note that we've included a link here to the training module created by the Canada Research Chairs Program on Bias in Peer Review. We highly recommend that you take this online training session to address biases and identify them. Inviting people with diverse backgrounds as reviewers is a powerful way to protect against bias in the peer review process. Quite different reviewers can mitigate each other's knowledge gaps and blind spots to provide you with a more thorough and balanced overall view of the article. So use those different search strategies to help identify reviewers and actively think about things like gender, career stage, affiliation, ethnicity, and school of thought when building your reviewer list. Deliberately inviting researchers from equity deserving groups to review manuscripts can get more yeses to review. And importantly, you can provide people with a point of entry for engagement with publishing as either reviewers and maybe perhaps later on as editors. So ultimately growing and strengthening the journal community. Okay, so if you've been invited to review a manuscript, what are some things you should consider in whether or not to take on the assignment? As a peer reviewer, there are things that you can and cannot control. The main things that are out of your control are when and what and who you get asked to review. But what you can control is your time management, whether or not you say yes to the paper, to review the paper, your behavior and tone, being aware of and recognizing biases, doing your homework and being prepared, and networking in order to get asked to review the right kind of papers. Peer review should provide expert and timely feedback. Peer reviewers have a responsibility to agree to peer review only those papers they can assess within the deadline, or to renegotiate an alternative deadline with the editor before agreeing to review. And responsibility to advise the journal's editorial office if the review will be delayed and by how long. Peer review should establish if the work is reliable and potentially reproducible. Peer reviewers have a responsibility to evaluate the science according to appropriateness of the methodology, completeness and accuracy of the data, and interpretation of the results. And the responsibility to assess the completeness of the research reporting, referring to reporting guideline checklists if appropriate to the study design. Peer review should be constructive and helpful, benefiting both the authors and the editors. So again, peer reviewers have a responsibility to help authors improve their work and help editors make a decision. Write comments to the authors that are clear, specific, and constructive, and support comments with evidence, citations, or supporting arguments so that authors and editors understand the basis of your comments. So don't forget the goals of peer review. It's to provide an expert opinion to the journal, to help authors improve their work, to give the kind of feedback that you would like to receive if you were the author. So be humble, transparent, and critical in a helpful way. To be respectful of time, like the editor's time, the author's time, and your own time. To communicate with the journal if anything comes up, if you spot an issue or you need more time, and to be aware of potential biases. And also remember to be confident. There's a reason why they asked you to review. So just believe in yourself that you got this. Okay, so one thing to think of is competing interest. CSP defines a competing interest as anything that interferes with or could reasonably be perceived as interfering with the full and objective presentation, peer review, editorial decision making, or publication of research or non-research articles submitted to the journal. Competing interests can be financial or non-financial, professional or personal. Competing interests can arise in relationship to an organization or another person. So things that we look for are typically whether the two parties, for instance, and an author and like two parties, like an author and an institution or a reviewer, if they're all from the same institution, or whether they have recently co-published together on recent papers or any other discernible collaborations. Sometimes it's not possible for an editor to tell, so it relies on the honesty system. And these things usually come out to light sooner, so it's best to be upfront about any competing interests. Rigorous peer review relies on everyone involved behaving responsibly and ethically. CSP is a member of COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics, and we encourage reviewers to become familiar with the ethical guidelines for peer reviewers, as well as with these core responsibilities. So you want to check for competing interests, ask yourself these 7 questions. Could you profitably or be negatively impacted financially by the submitted research? Do you have a personal relationship with the authors? Are you and the authors rivals or competitors? Have you recently worked at the same institution or organization as the authors? Have you or are you currently collaborating with the authors? Have you recently published with the authors? Or have you recently held grants with the authors? Finally, we want you to remember that there is help available. Here's a list of resources and I can share this after, that we can find to be excellent for writing and reviewing. And if you're serving as a reviewer or as an author, you can always reach out to the journal's editorial office for help. Yeah, you can always reach out to us for help with the manuscript on software, which is our Scholar One system, or if you have questions about the peer review process. Thank you very much. I am going to unshare.
Thank you, Hilary, for that insightful presentations. It was very broad. Well, now we'll move into our Q&A session. If you haven't already, please type your question in the chat and I read them out for Hilary to answer. In the meantime, maybe I can start with I wrote down so many questions here. Maybe one for you, Hilary. Are you okay with that?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, how do you choose the right journal for your research when you are at the point you have written down all your manuscript and you have to choose what
Yeah, I
are the
think you look
best
for
advice?
the values that align with you. Like if you're looking for a not-for-profit or if you're okay with a commercial publisher, that might be one way that will influence whether or not you want to choose that journal. If open access is important versus closed, that's another thing to consider. You want to check the scope of the journal to see if it fits within your research. If it's related to any specific societies that was related with your work and you want to amplify that work further. I think those are good bases to start with. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I can ask another one.
Mhm.
Actually, do you have any tools or resources that could help streamline the submission process, help work through the submission process?
Tools to streamline the submission process. I will have to get back to you. I don't know if we do have anything, but I can find out for sure if we do.
Okay, I was like, oh, I don't know if that exists.
I don't think so, but I know, for example, some journals who are partnered with bioRxiv, if you submit your manuscript to a preprint, it can like seamlessly be submitted to the journal once it's ready to be sent to the journal after it's been with the preprint for a while. So that way you don't have to resubmit all the authors' names and information. It'll be populated into the manuscript management system.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
And another one was just you shared implicit association test at some point in the presentation for bias. So this
Yes.
is a website.
Yes, it is. And I will share that in the chat right now. And I can also circulate the slides later.
Yes, could help us, everyone, to identify the bias. So it's for scientists or it's for everyone?
I think it's for everyone who can just kind of get an idea on their biases.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, we still have 9 attendees here, so it's your time if you want to ask some question or if you have comments for Hilary, for us. You're welcome. So I can wait a few more minutes here. Just to be sure, the attendees can write questions. Sometimes I don't have the authorization. Here they can. Just to be sure.
You're welcome, Marie-Caroline.
Thank you, Marie-Caroline. So if we don't have much question, thank you. Thank everyone for being here today, and to Hilary for her amazing presentation, so broad, many content here. We hope you find it helpful, as Marie-Caroline said, and the recording will be shared with you shortly. So via the YouTube channel of Canadian Science Publishing. And yeah, have a great day, great afternoon.
Thank you.